Right now, somewhere in the world, someone is stirring sugar into their morning coffee. Maybe that's you. Maybe you're doing it right now. It's such a small, ordinary thing. A little spoon, a few white crystals, a sweeter sip. But here's what nobody tells you when you do that. That sugar in your cup, it has a history soaked in blood. It helped build empires. It triggered revolutions. It moved millions of people across oceans against their will. And right now, in the 21st century, it is quietly killing more people than most wars ever did. This is not a video about nutrition. This is not a lecture about cutting carbs or eating clean. This is the true story of how one plant, one single crop, became the force that shaped the modern world. It drew the borders of nations. It decided who was free and who was enslaved. It funded revolutions, fueled industrial economies, and built the wealth that some of the most powerful families in Western history still enjoy today. And most people have absolutely no idea. So buckle up, because we are going back 3,000 years. And by the time we are done, every time you reach for that sugar bowl, you will see something completely different. Let me tell you what sugar actually is. Beyond the chemistry, sugar is power. It always has been. For most of human history, sweetness was rare. It was precious. It was something people would cross deserts and oceans just to get a taste of. And the moment humans figured out how to produce it in large quantities, every single power structure in the world shifted to control it. Sugar gave European empires a reason to colonize the tropics. It gave them a reason to reach into West Africa and kidnap human beings by the millions. It funded the very economic system that built the cities we live in today: London, Amsterdam, Lisbon, Bordeaux. Much of that wealth traces back, at least in part, to sugar plantations worked by enslaved people. But sugar did not stop there. After it finished reshaping the old world, it came for your body. It snuck into your food supply. It engineered your cravings. And today, the health crisis it is causing costs the world hundreds of billions of dollars a year. Here is what we are going to cover. We are going from ancient India all the way to the present day. We will talk about kings and slaves, revolutions and boycotts, corporations and public health disasters. And if you want to follow the full journey, hit subscribe right now. There is a lot more like this coming. Let's start at the very beginning. The story of sugar begins somewhere around 8,000 years ago. Not in Europe, not in the Middle East, in New Guinea. The people of New Guinea did not have factories or refineries. They did not have chemists or food scientists. What they had was a tall, woody grass growing wild around them. And at some point, someone put a stalk of it in their mouth and chewed. And it was sweet. That plant was sugarcane. And for thousands of years, that's all it was. Something you chewed on. You crushed the stalk between your teeth, got that rush of sweetness, and spat out the fiber. Simple, delicious, and entirely local. Then the knowledge of this plant started spreading through Southeast Asia, into China, and eventually into India. And that's where something remarkable happened. Indian farmers and scientists, we are talking roughly 2,000 years ago, figured out how to do something no one had done before. They figured out how to turn sugarcane juice into solid crystals. They could dry it, store it, transport it. They had invented sugar as we know it. They even had a word for it. In Sanskrit, the ancient language of India, the word was sharkara, which literally means gravel or sand, because that's what it looked like: tiny, rough crystals, like pale sand. And here is a fun little fact to drop at your next dinner party. That Sanskrit word sharkara is the ancestor of the word sugar in almost every European language. It became shakar in Persian, sukar in Arabic, sukarum in Latin, sucre in French, and finally, sugar in English. One word, traveling the world for 3,000 years. That is how far this plant reached. Now here is where the story gets interesting. In the year 510 BC, one of the most powerful men on earth, marched his army into India. His name was Darius I, Emperor of Persia. He had an empire that stretched from Greece to the borders of Central Asia. He had conquered more land than almost anyone in history up to that point. And when his soldiers arrived in the Indus Valley and tasted sugarcane for the first time, they were stunned. The reports that came back to Darius described it as, and I love this phrase, the reed that gives honey without the need of bees. Think about that for a second. In a world without candy, without chocolate, without soda, without literally any of the processed sweetness we take for granted, honey was the sweetest thing most people had ever tasted. And here was a plant that produced something just as sweet, abundantly, without bees. This was astonishing. But here is the thing. The Indians who knew how to make sugar, how to actually refine it into those crystalline granules, they were not sharing that knowledge. The process of turning raw cane into sugar was kept like a state secret, a classified technology. You could buy the finished product, but the method, that stayed locked up. So Persian merchants could buy sugar and sell it at enormous markups. But they could not make it themselves. For over 1,000 years, India held that monopoly, and the rest of the world paid whatever price was asked, until someone finally broke in. By the way, if this kind of deep dive into history is something you enjoy, drop a like on this video. It genuinely helps more people find this content. The year is 642 AD. The Arab armies of the early Islamic Caliphate sweep into Persia and conquer it with stunning speed. And among everything they find in Persia, the palaces, the libraries, the trade routes, they find the sugar. Not just the product, the process. For the first time, people outside of India had full access to the knowledge of how to make refined sugar, and the Arabs, who were brilliant traders and agriculturalists, ran with it. Wherever they went, one historian wrote, the medieval Arabs brought with them sugar, the product and the technology of its production. They took sugarcane cultivation westward, across the Islamic world. They planted it in Egypt, in North Africa, in Sicily, in southern Spain. They developed irrigation systems to keep it growing in drier climates. They built what we might today call sugar mills, early industrial processing sites, right on the plantations. By the time Europe began its crusades in the 11th century, Arab civilization had been refining and trading sugar for 400 years. And when the Crusader knights arrived in the Holy Land and tasted sugar for the first time, they lost their minds over it. They called it a new spice. They brought samples home to their lords and ladies in France and England and Germany, like returning explorers showing off exotic treasure. In England, the first recorded shipment of sugar arrived in 1069. Medieval cookbooks began calling for it. European royalty started using it to display wealth, sugar sculptures at banquets, sugar-dusted delicacies, subtleties, made of molded sugar as table centerpieces. But here is the problem. Sugar was outrageously expensive. Per pound, it cost more than most workers earned in a week. It was used less like food and more like a spice. A pinch here, a pinch there. The demand was there. The supply was not. And that is exactly the tension that would drive the next chapter of this story. A tension that would result in one of the greatest crimes in human history. Comment below with one word. What do you think of when you hear the word sugar? Go ahead. I'm curious what comes up. The year 1492 changes everything. You know the story. Columbus sails west, lands in the Caribbean, and a new era begins. What you might not know is what Columbus brought with him on his second voyage in 1493. Sugarcane. He had picked it up in the Canary Islands, where the Portuguese had already been growing it successfully, and he planted it on the island of Hispaniola, what is today Haiti, and the Dominican Republic. It grew beautifully. The Caribbean climate was perfect for sugarcane, hot, humid, with rich soil, and plenty of rain. The plant thrived in a way it never quite had in the Mediterranean. European investors took notice immediately. Within decades, sugar plantations were spreading across the Caribbean, into Brazil, into the coastal regions of South America. The Portuguese were first. They turned northeastern Brazil into one of the largest sugar-producing zones the world had ever seen, and the profits were staggering. We are talking about returns that made other investments look like spare change. Sugar was so valuable, so in demand across Europe, that the English colonists literally called it white gold. A single successful sugar plantation could make its owner wealthy beyond imagination in just a few years. By 1750, British and French plantations in the Caribbean were producing the majority of the world's sugar supply. The islands of Jamaica, Barbados, Saint-Domingue, which we now call Haiti, had become the most economically valuable pieces of land on the planet. More valuable than all of continental North America. Let that sink in. These small Caribbean islands were worth more to European empires than the entire landmass of what would become the United States. Not because of gold, not because of oil, because of sugar. But there was one enormous problem with all of this. Sugar was brutally, mercilessly, exhaustingly hard to grow and harvest. Sugarcane fields had to be cleared by hand. The cane had to be cut by hand, hauled by hand, fed into mills by hand. The juice had to be boiled in enormous vats, in tropical heat, for hours. The harvest season was relentless, round the clock, with no break, because once the cane was cut, it had to be processed immediately or it would spoil. You needed an enormous amount of labor, constantly, in conditions that were physically devastating. The colonizers tried using indigenous peoples of the Caribbean first, but disease wiped out those populations with horrifying speed. Within decades of European contact, entire civilizations that had lived in the Caribbean for thousands of years were gone, and so the plantation owners looked across the Atlantic. This is the part of the story that I need you to really sit with. Not just absorb as historical data, but actually think about what this meant for real human beings. Because what happened next was not an accident. It was a system, a deliberately designed, economically optimized system for moving human beings across oceans and working them to death in service of European sugar consumption. It was called the triangular trade, and it worked like this. The first leg, ships loaded with manufactured goods, guns, textiles, alcohol, metal tools, sailed from European ports down to the west coast of Africa. There, those goods were exchanged with African slave traders and local rulers for captive human beings. The second leg, and this was called the Middle Passage, those same ships, now packed with human cargo, crossed the Atlantic to the Americas. And I want you to understand what packed actually means here. Enslaved people were chained together below deck, lying on wooden shelves in spaces too small to sit upright. The crossing took weeks. The heat was unbearable. Disease spread through the hold like wildfire. People died next to the people they were chained to. Historians estimate that between 15 and 25% of enslaved Africans died before they ever reached shore. 1 in 4 people, dead, before they even arrived. And those who did survive, what waited for them was not relief. What waited for them was a sugar plantation. The third leg, the ships that had delivered enslaved people to the Americas were loaded up with sugar, rum, and molasses, and sailed back to Europe, where those products were sold at enormous profit. The profit funded the next voyage, and the whole machine started again. Over the entire history of this trade, historians estimate that more than 12.5 million people were forcibly transported across the Atlantic. The majority of them, somewhere between half and 2/3, were destined for sugar plantations. 12.5 million people, for sugar. I think about this number a lot, and I genuinely believe this is one of those facts that deserves to be said out loud more often than it is. This was not some distant abstraction. These were farmers, artisans, parents, children, People with names and languages and communities, kidnapped and turned into fuel for a global sugar economy. And the people who owned those plantations, they became some of the wealthiest, most politically connected families in European history. Let me tell you about a British family called the Lascelles. They first acquired sugar plantations in Barbados in 1648. Henry Lascelles made a fortune not just from sugar, but from lending money to other slave traders and planters. His son used that inherited wealth to buy more estates. Their descendants married into the British royal family. The Lascelles family owned sugar plantations worked by enslaved people until 1975. 1975. That is within living memory for millions of people. On sugar plantations across the Caribbean, the work was designed to extract maximum output from human beings, with minimal regard for their survival. In Jamaica, in the 16th century, 60% of all enslaved people were put to work in sugar fields. By the 19th century, that number had risen to 90%. The harvest season, called crop time, ran around the clock. Shifts at the boiling houses could last 18 hours or more. The machinery was dangerous. Burns, amputations, and accidents were common. And because it was always cheaper for plantation owners to replace a worker than to provide proper care, there was no incentive to keep people safe. The average life expectancy for an enslaved person on a Caribbean sugar plantation was brutally short. Planters accounted for the fact that workers would die and budgeted for replacements accordingly. This was not incidental. This was the business model. And it worked. It made fortunes. It built cities. The sugar trade funded the growth of banks, insurance companies, and shipping firms in London and Amsterdam and Lisbon. It was, by many historians' accounts, a key engine of early capitalism itself. By the end of the 18th century, the connection between sugar and slavery was being called out publicly for the first time. In 1791, a British abolitionist named William Fox published a pamphlet that reached hundreds of thousands of readers. It argued that every pound of sugar a British household bought was stained with the blood of the people who produced it. If you are enjoying this video and you want to see more history content like this, subscribe right now. We go deep on the stories that actually shaped our world. Here is something that almost nobody knows. The first large-scale consumer boycott in modern history was about sugar. In the late 1780s and early 1790s, a movement began in Britain, led largely by Quakers and abolitionist groups, calling on ordinary people to stop buying West Indian sugar. The argument was simple and radical. If you buy sugar produced by enslaved people, you are part of the system. They published pamphlets with titles like A Plea for the Poor. They printed materials with slogans comparing sugar to blood. And people responded. Across Britain, households began switching to sugar labeled as being produced without slave labor, most of it from India. Women in particular drove the boycott because they were the ones controlling household purchases. They displayed slave-free sugar bowls in their homes as a political statement, as a badge of moral identity. At its peak, somewhere between 300,000 and 400,000 people in Britain were participating in the boycott. And here is what I find genuinely fascinating about this. It is the direct ancestor of every modern consumer activism campaign. Fair trade coffee, ethical fashion, cruelty-free products. Every time someone makes a purchase decision based on how something was produced, that lineage traces back to these 18th century British households refusing to put West Indian sugar in their tea. People figured out, 250 years ago, that ordinary consumer choices could be a form of political power, and they were right. Britain abolished slavery in its territories in 1833. Not immediately. There was a transitional period, and planters received massive financial compensation, while formerly enslaved people received nothing. But the legal status of slavery ended. The boycott did not single-handedly end slavery. but it helped shift public consciousness in a way that made abolition politically possible. That matters. All right, I need you to focus for this part, because this is one of the most consequential events in modern history, and most people in the West know almost nothing about it. The year is 1791. The island of Saint-Domingue, which would later become Haiti, was the crown jewel of the entire French Empire. And when I say crown jewel, I mean that in the most staggering economic sense. Saint-Domingue, a single Caribbean island smaller than the state of South Carolina, was producing approximately 40% of all the sugar imported into Europe, 60% of all the coffee. The wealth it generated for France exceeded the total revenue that Britain received from all 13 of its North American colonies combined. Haiti was, by any economic measure, the most valuable piece of real estate on the planet, and it was built entirely on the labor of enslaved people. By 1790, the enslaved population of Saint-Domingue had reached 500,000 people. The white French planter class numbered around 40,000. The math was obvious. The tension was unbearable. Then the French Revolution happened, and ideas about liberty, equality, and the rights of man began circulating across the Atlantic. And 500,000 people who had been denied all of those rights heard those words. On the night of August 22, 1791, a massive uprising began in the northern plains of Saint-Domingue. Within weeks, more than 100,000 people had joined the rebellion. Hundreds of plantations were burned, and over the next 13 years, the enslaved population of Saint-Domingue fought against the French army, the British army, and the Spanish, all simultaneously, and won. In 1804, Haiti became the first nation in history to be founded by people who had liberated themselves from slavery. The only successful slave revolution in the history of the world. This was the most radical political event of the entire revolutionary era. More radical than the American Revolution. More radical than the French Revolution. Because those revolutions were carried out by people who were already, in the eyes of the law, free. The Haitian Revolution was carried out by people who were legally classified as property. And the ripple effects were immediate and global. Sugar prices spiked across Europe because the world's largest sugar producer had just stopped producing sugar. The French, desperate and humiliated, began searching for an alternative source of sugar that did not require Caribbean plantations at all. They found one. We'll get to that in a moment. And the United States? They did not recognize Haitian independence until 1862, 58 years after the Revolution, because American slaveholders were terrified of what Haiti represented. A successful slave revolt, just a few hundred miles off the coast of the American South, was not something they wanted acknowledged as possible. Comment below, before watching this video, did you already know about the Haitian Revolution? Just yes or no. I'm genuinely curious how many people were taught this in school. The Haitian Revolution had a consequence that almost nobody connects to it: the invention of the European beet sugar industry. Here is the chain of events. Haiti stops producing sugar. France, which had relied on Saint-Domingue for an enormous portion of its sugar supply, is suddenly facing a crisis. Napoleon is at war with Britain, which controls most sea routes. West Indian sugar is hard to get. Prices are going through the roof. And then a French chemist named Benjamin de la Serte, building on earlier research, successfully demonstrates that you can extract sugar from sugar beets, a root vegetable that grows perfectly well in temperate European climates. Napoleon, who needed every political win he could get, immediately threw state support behind the beet sugar industry. Within a decade, France had hundreds of beet sugar factories, and the technology spread rapidly across Europe. This was a complete restructuring of the global sugar economy. For the first time in history, major sugar production did not require tropical colonies. It did not require the Caribbean climate. It did not require enslaved labor from Africa. Europe could grow its own sweetener in its own fields. Beet sugar did not end exploitation entirely. The beet fields still needed labor, and that labor was often poorly paid and harshly treated. But the geography of sugar power shifted permanently. The Caribbean islands, that had been worth more than entire continents, began a long economic decline. The plantation system that had been the engine of Atlantic capitalism started to fracture. And the world that emerged from that fracture is, more or less, the one we still live in today. Britain abolished slavery in 1833. This is usually presented as a straightforward moral triumph, and in some ways it was. But here is what the history books often gloss over. When slavery was abolished in British territories, the British government paid out £20 million in compensation. That was roughly 40% of the entire national budget at the time. The compensation went to the slave owners, not to the people who had been enslaved, not to the families whose labor had built those fortunes, not to the communities that had been shattered. The money went to the plantation owners as payment for the loss of their human property, and then, almost immediately, plantation owners brought in a new source of labor, indentured workers from India. These workers were technically free, technically paid a wage, technically able to return home after their contracts ended. But in practice, the contracts were manipulated, the pay was barely subsistence, the conditions were brutal, and returning home was often impossible. Slavery had been abolished. Exploitation had not. This is important to understand, not because it means abolition did not matter. It absolutely did. But because it shows us that moral progress and economic exploitation can coexist, that a system can change its legal form while preserving its essential function. The sugar plantation, in some shape or another, kept running. Fast forward to 19th century Britain. Industrialization is transforming the country. Factories are rising. Cities are exploding in size. Millions of people are leaving agricultural life and entering the urban working class. And here is where sugar takes on a completely new role. Tea had become the national drink of Britain. And tea, as anyone who has tasted it unsweetened knows, is bitter. But a spoonful of sugar, cheap sugar, mass-produced sugar, sugar that by this point was affordable for even working-class households, made it palatable. British tea imports grew 400 times over the course of the 18th century. And that combination, sweet tea, bread spread with jam made from sugar, biscuits and cakes, became the fuel of the industrial working class. Workers drank sugary tea before their shifts to get an energy boost. They drank it on breaks. They ate sugar-sweetened foods that were calorie-dense and cheap. Sugar had made the leap from luxury to necessity in under 300 years. It had gone from a spice reserved for royalty and the very wealthy to something a factory worker in Manchester considered a basic part of daily life. The economics of this transformation shaped international politics in ways we still feel today. Britain's demand for tea drove its colonial ambitions in China and India. Its demand for sugar shaped its Caribbean policies for centuries. The food habits of an industrializing European working class were entangled, whether they knew it or not, with plantation economies, colonial trade routes, and the entire architecture of global inequality. Sugar was not just in the teacup, it was in the system. Now we jump to the 20th century, and this is where the story comes home, literally into your kitchen. After World War II, the global food industry underwent a transformation. Processing technology improved, refrigeration expanded, supermarkets replaced local markets, and an entire industry of packaged, shelf-stable, convenient food products emerged, and almost all of it contained added sugar. But the really pivotal moment came in 1970, when a sweetener called high fructose corn syrup, HFCS for short, was developed and began entering the American food supply. High fructose corn syrup was cheaper to produce than cane sugar. It was liquid, which made it easy to incorporate into processed foods, and it tasted sweet. Soft drink companies switched to it. Bread manufacturers used it. Sauces, condiments, cereals, yogurts, snack foods. All of them got sweeter, quietly, without most consumers noticing. The numbers that followed are extraordinary. By 1999, the average American was consuming around 158 pounds of sugar per year. That is roughly 70 kilograms. A little over 1.5 pounds of sugar per person per day. Today, researchers estimate that approximately 75% of all packaged foods and beverages in American supermarkets contain added sugar in some form. You are not just eating it when you eat candy or cake, you are eating it in bread, in pasta sauce, in salad dressing, in ketchup, in crackers, in soups, in protein bars that are marketed as health food. The food industry had done what European empires once did. It had made sugar inescapable. Only this time, the delivery mechanism was a supermarket aisle instead of a plantation. If this video is making you think about things differently, hit like and subscribe. We have more like this coming. Here is what happened to our bodies when sugar became inescapable. Between 1975 and 2016, global obesity rates tripled. By 2016, more than 650 million adults worldwide were classified as obese. In the United States alone, the obesity rate nearly doubled between 1990 and 2016. Researchers studying this crisis found a pattern that was hard to ignore. The explosion in adult obesity that happened from the 1990s onward appeared to track, with a generational delay, the explosion in sugar consumption that had happened from the 1970s onward. Children raised on high-sugar diets in the 1970s and 1980s were experiencing the metabolic consequences as adults 2 and 3 decades later. The connection between sugar, particularly fructose, and conditions like type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular disease, and fatty liver disease has been demonstrated in study after study. And here is something the history actually predicted. England was the first country to develop mass access to cheap Caribbean sugar in the 18th century, and researchers have found that obesity, diabetes, hypertension, and cardiovascular disease appeared first in England, ahead of the rest of Europe. The timeline maps almost perfectly onto the history of sugar access. The Netherlands, which had its own early access to sugar through Dutch East India Company trade routes, was not far behind. We are, in a very literal sense, living through the biological consequences of decisions made by European empires 400 years ago. The sugar plantation is gone, but the sugar is still in the food. One more thing before we close this out, because this matters. The global sugar industry today is not neutral. It is not a level playing field. Sugarcane, the tropical crop, the one that started all of this, is still produced predominantly in the global south. Brazil, India, Thailand, and other developing nations grow the vast majority of the world's cane sugar. The workers who cut and process that cane are often among the lowest paid agricultural workers on the planet, working in conditions that, while no longer slavery, are frequently dangerous and exploitative. Meanwhile, in the United States and Europe, sugar beet production, which grows in temperate climates, receives significant government subsidies. European and American beet sugar producers are protected from competition by trade policies that keep imported cane sugar at a disadvantage in those markets. This imbalance is not accidental. It is the legacy of the same colonial economic architecture that the plantation system built. The countries that were impoverished and destabilized by centuries of colonial sugar extraction are now at a structural disadvantage in the global sugar trade. Fair trade certification has made some inroads. Consumers in wealthy countries who pay more for ethically sourced products create real economic pressure, but the scale of the problem dwarfs the scale of the solution so far. The empire of sugar has changed its form, but it has not disappeared. We started this video with a coffee cup, a morning ritual, a small pleasure, something unremarkable. But I hope that by now, you see it differently. That coffee cup connects you to New Guinea 8,000 years ago, where people first chewed sugarcane and discovered something wonderful. It connects you to Darius of Persia, standing in the Indus Valley, astonished by a reed that gave honey without bees. It connects you to Arab merchants carrying crystalline sugar across the Mediterranean, to Crusader knights bringing it home like treasure, to Portuguese planters sailing to Brazil with cane cuttings and a plan. It connects you to 12.5 million people who were taken from their homes, chained in the hold of ships, and worked to death in tropical heat so that sugar could be cheap enough for a European household to afford. It connects you to 500,000 people in Haiti who decided that was enough and fought for 13 years against the most powerful armies in the world and won. And it connects you to the food scientists in the 1970s who figured out how to make corn syrup sweet enough to substitute for sugar and put it in everything and quietly rewrote the health outcomes of an entire generation. Sugar is in your blood right now, metabolized from something you ate today, and it got there through one of the longest, strangest, most consequential journeys in human history. I think that is worth knowing. Before I close, I want to say something directly. One of the things I find most remarkable about the sugar story, and I have spent a lot of time with this history, is the fact that ordinary people have changed it before. The abolitionists who organized the sugar boycott in 18th century Britain were not politicians. They were not wealthy. They were households, mostly women, making a purchasing decision and attaching a moral meaning to it. And that movement helped shift the political conditions that made abolition possible. We tend to think of individual consumer choices as too small to matter. What difference does it make whether I buy this or that at the grocery store? The problem is too big, the system is too entrenched, and I understand that feeling. I have felt it myself. But history keeps showing us that it is not entirely true. Consumer pressure has moved corporations. Boycotts have ended practices that seemed permanent. People paying attention and making deliberate choices at scale have changed what gets produced and how. The question for our moment is not whether we can individually fix the global sugar industry. We cannot. The question is whether we are even paying attention to what we are consuming and where it comes from and what it costs. Not just at the register, but in the world. That feels like a question worth sitting with. If you made it to the end of this video, thank you. Genuinely. This is the kind of history that I think everyone deserves to know, and the fact that you watched all of it means a lot. Subscribe if you have not already. There is so much more of this to come. Leave a comment with the one thing from this video that surprised you most, and share this with someone who thinks they already know the history of the world. Because sometimes, the most world-shaping forces are the ones hiding in plain sight. Right there in your morning cup.